I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The House of Blue Glass had been the talk of London society for 3 seasons running, and on this particular November evening, as I made my way through the rain-swept grounds of Belmont Manor, I could well understand why. Lady Vivian Belmont's extraordinary conservatory rose before me like a cathedral of cobalt and steel, its soaring glass walls transforming the pale lamplight within into something ethereal and otherworldly. Every pane was tinted the deepest sapphire blue, casting all who moved within into an aquatic dream that was both beautiful and faintly unsettling. I'd been invited to Lady Vivian's monthly salon, a carefully curated gathering of artists, collectors, and what she playfully called interesting specimens of humanity. As Captain Hastings, I confess I was never entirely certain into which category I fell, but the invitation had come as a welcome respite from London's grey November, and my friend Poirot was abroad consulting on a case in Belgium. The conservatory's interior took my breath away. Exotic palms and orchids created intimate alcoves throughout the vast space, while a gentle fountain provided a musical backdrop to the evening's conversation. The blue-tinted light transformed everything it touched. The lady's jewels gleamed like captured starlight, while the gentleman's evening dress took on an almost spectral quality. It was, as Lady Vivian had once remarked to the society papers, like dining at the bottom of an enchanted sea. Our hostess moved through her guests with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to orchestrating such evenings. Lady Vivian Belmont was a striking woman in her early 50s, possessed of that particular elegance that comes from breeding, wealth, and the absolute confidence that both provide. Her late husband, Sir Reginald, had been a noted collector of modern art, and she had continued his passion with remarkable acumen. "Captain Hastings," she greeted me warmly, "how delightful that you could join us. I believe you know most everyone here, but do let me introduce our newest acquisition, Mr. Julian de Vere." De Vere was a man of perhaps 40, lean and handsome in the predatory manner that certain women find irresistible. He managed art investments, I was told, and there was already whispered speculation about his growing influence over Lady Vivian's considerable collection. His smile was charming, his manner impeccable, yet something about him put me on guard. Perhaps the way his eyes seemed to calculate the value of everything they fell upon, including the people. The other guests formed a fascinating tableau in the blue light. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, Lady Vivian's younger sister, possessed a beauty that had once graced the society pages and a sharp wit that had kept her there. Dr. Sebastian Monk, a distinguished physician and amateur art historian, attended with quiet authority to Miss Penelope Belmont, Lady Vivian's stepdaughter, who suffered from what were delicately termed nervous episodes. Miss Beatrice Vale, the celebrated soprano, stood near a magnificent display of white orchids, humming softly under her breath, while watching De Vere with an expression I could not quite decipher. Colonel Weatherby, ramrod straight despite his 70 years, regaled a small group with tales of his collecting adventures in the Far East. Finally, there was Monsieur René Vallon, the French artist whom Lady Vivian had commissioned to create a special piece for the conservatory's centerpiece, a swirling glass sculpture that seemed to capture smoke and moonlight in its crystalline depths. Dinner had been served at a round table placed strategically among the palms, where the blue light created an atmosphere of intimate conspiracy. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the excellent wine, touching on art, literature, and the delicious scandals that season London society like salt. It was during the final course that De Vere rose to propose a toast. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention, his crystal glass catching the sapphire light as he lifted it high. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the conservatory, "to our gracious hostess, Lady Vivian, and to the House of Blue Glass, surely the most beautiful setting for the most beautiful company in all of London." There was something in his tone, a note of triumph perhaps, or possession, that made me glance around the table. I noticed Miss Penelope's hands trembling slightly as she raised her glass, while Mrs. Ashworth's smile seemed frozen in place. Dr. Monk's attention appeared focused entirely on his patient, but I caught him watching de Vere with an expression of clinical interest. We all drank to the toast. De Vere drained his glass with evident satisfaction, then took a step backward, perhaps to avoid one of the trailing palm fronds. It was then that something extraordinary and terrible occurred. His face, already ethereal in the blue light, suddenly contorted with what I can only describe as surprise and horror. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like breaking stars. He clutched at his throat, opened his mouth as if to speak, then pitched forward onto the pristine white tiles. Miss Vale screamed. The sound echoed through the glass cathedral, multiplied and distorted until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dr. Monk was beside de Vere in an instant, his professional training overriding the shock that held the rest of us frozen. He knelt, checked for a pulse, bent close to listen for breathing. Even in the strange light, I could see the color draining from de Vere's face with alarming rapidity. "Stand back, please," Dr. Monk said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Give him air." But it was already too late. Julian de Vere, who moments before had been the picture of health and confidence, was unmistakably dead. As I stood in that cathedral of blue glass, surrounded by the shocked faces of our fellow guests, I caught a faint, bitter scent that seemed oddly familiar, something like almonds, sweet yet acrid. Near the shattered remains of de Vere's glass, I noticed a small dark stain on the marble, and on his cuff, a tiny droplet that gleamed like a jewel in the sapphire light. It was then that my thoughts turned, as they so often did in moments of crisis, to a certain Belgian gentleman with an egg-shaped head and an obsession with order. The House of Blue Glass had been designed as a temple to beauty and light, but tonight it had become something far more sinister, a locked room where murder had been committed in full view of 8 witnesses, none of whom had seen the killer strike. As Lady Vivian gave orders for the police to be summoned and the conservatory to be sealed, I found myself wishing desperately for the insight of Hercule Poirot and his little grey cells. For I had the uncomfortable feeling that this was only the beginning of a very complex and dangerous game. The silence that followed Miss Vale's scream seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the gentle splash of the fountain and Dr. Monk's quiet, professional murmurs as he knelt beside the fallen man. The blue light that had seemed so enchanting moments before now cast everything in an otherworldly pallor, transforming our elegant gathering into something from a fever dream. Lady Vivian, demonstrating the steel backbone that had made her one of London's most formidable hostesses, moved with swift efficiency. "Morrison," she called to her butler, who stood frozen in the doorway, "telephone the police immediately, and seal the conservatory. No one is to enter or leave until they arrive." Her voice carried absolute authority, though I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the back of her chair. Dr. Monk rose slowly, his face grave. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced quietly. "Mr. de Vere is dead." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through our small group. Miss Penelope gave a small, choked sob and pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Colonel Weatherby's military bearing seemed to stiffen even further. The bitter almond scent I had detected earlier seemed to hang in the air like an accusation. Dr. Monk must have noticed it too, for he bent closer to examine the shattered remains of de Vere's wine-glass, careful not to disturb the scene. "The onset was extraordinarily rapid," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "And that distinctive odor, I would venture to suggest prussic acid, though I cannot be certain without proper examination." Mrs. Ashworth, pale but composed, drew her evening wrap closer about her shoulders. "Surely this must be some terrible accident, Doctor. Perhaps contamination from the conservatory's plant treatments, or something in the crystal itself." "Movements," Did he step away from the table, perhaps speak privately with someone? The question hung in the air like the lingering scent of bitter almonds, and I realized that Hercule Poirot had already begun to weave the threads of his investigation. The question hung in the crystalline air like a challenge, and I watched as each of our fellow guests seemed to retreat into their own memories of those final moments. It was Colonel Weatherby who broke the silence, his military bearing evident even in the strange sapphire light. "Now that you mention it, Poirot, the fellow did step away briefly during the fish course," he said, stroking his white mustache thoughtfully. "Claimed he needed air. Rather ironic, considering we were already in this glass cathedral. He walked to the terrace doors, stood there for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. Ah, très intéressant," Poirot murmured, his keen eyes noting the slight shift in Lady Vivian's posture. "And who else observed this absence?" Dr. Monk nodded gravely. I offered to accompany him. As he seemed somewhat flushed, he declined, saying he simply needed a moment to collect himself. When he returned, he appeared more animated, almost excited, I would say. Miss Penelope spoke up unexpectedly, her voice barely above a whisper. The glasses were moved. When all eyes turned to her, she seemed to shrink into her chair. I notice such things. I can't help it. When we first sat down, Julian's glass was positioned closer to the centerpiece, but after he returned, it had shifted slightly to the right. "Most observant, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "And did you see who moved it?" She shook her head, pale fingers twisting her handkerchief. "The servants were clearing between courses. It could have been Morrison or Ellis or—" She trailed off, her gaze darting nervously around the table. Lady Vivian called for her butler, who materialized with ghostly efficiency. "Morrison, please tell Monsieur Poirot about the wine service this evening." The butler inclined his head with practiced dignity. The dessert wine was a sauterne from Sir Reginald's cellar, decanted an hour beforehand. Ellis set the glasses while the final course was cleared, filling each to the proper level, beginning with her ladyship and ending with Mr. de Vere. "And after the glasses were placed, who touched them?" Poirot inquired with deceptive mildness. Morrison's expression grew pained. "No one should have, sir. We are most careful about such matters." He hesitated. "Though I did observe that when Mr. de Vere returned from his walk, he took up a glass that was positioned slightly to his left, perhaps an inch from where Ellis had originally placed it." Miss Vale, who had been unusually quiet since her initial scream, spoke with obvious reluctance. "When Julian made the toast, he had his handkerchief in his left hand. He'd been dabbing his lip, said the blue light made him feel quite dry, and as he raised the glass, he wrapped the handkerchief around the stem. I noticed because it struck me as unusual." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. He moved closer to examine the shattered crystal near de Vere's chair, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. "Most curious," he murmured, loud enough for us all to hear. Near the broken glass, a small dark stain marked the pristine marble, and on de Vere's cuff, that tiny droplet I had noticed earlier gleamed like a malevolent jewel. "Hydrocyanic acid acts within seconds," Dr. Monk observed quietly. "The rapidity of onset suggests the poison was introduced immediately before consumption." "Precisely, mon ami," Poirot agreed, straightening. "The poison could not have been in the wine itself. All partook of the same bottle. Therefore, it was applied to the glass, most likely to the rim where contact with lips would ensure absorption. But when, and by whom?" Monsieur Vallon stepped forward, his artistic temperament evident in his agitated movements. "I examined my sculpture during the evening. The lighting had shifted, and I wished to ensure proper display. But I touched nothing else, I swear it." Mrs. Ashworth drew her evening wrap closer. "Surely this must be some terrible accident, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps contamination from the conservatory's treatments." "I think not, madame," Poirot replied smoothly. "The precision required, the timing, this was no accident." His gaze swept over our faces, each caught in the blue light like specimens in an elaborate display case. The handkerchief that appears and disappears, the glass that moves, the brief absence to admire art. All these create opportunity for one with sufficient nerve and preparation. Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. Right then, we'll need formal statements from everyone. Lady Vivian, might we use your drawing room? As we prepared to leave the conservatory, Poirot caught my arm. Hastings, mon ami, he murmured quietly. Examine the pantry and sideboard. Look not for what is present, but for what is conspicuously absent. Something very small, very deadly, and recently removed. The Blue Cathedral would keep its secrets for now, but I knew Poirot's little grey cells were already working to unlock them. Following Poirot's cryptic instruction, I made my way through the service corridors to the household's pantry, leaving behind the drawing room where Inspector Japp had begun his methodical interviews. The contrast between the conservatory's ethereal blue atmosphere and the solid, practical world of the servants' quarters was striking. Here, everything spoke of English efficiency and order, a reassuring antidote to the otherworldly quality of our dining experience. Morrison's domain was a testament to Victorian household management. Crystal decanters stood in perfect formation, silver gleamed from felt-lined drawers, and every bottle and jar occupied its designated position with military precision. Yet as I examined the area, more carefully, following Poirot's guidance to seek what was absent rather than present, something immediately caught my attention. On the sideboard nearest the conservatory doors, a silver tray bore the unmistakable outline of a small bottle, a clean square amid a faint bloom of dust that spoke of regular placement and recent removal. Beside this telling absence lay a folded service cloth, still damp in one corner. When I bent closer, that same bitter scent that had haunted the conservatory seemed to whisper from the fabric, faint but unmistakable. "Finding anything of interest, sir?" Morrison appeared in the doorway, his usual composure showing the first cracks I'd observed all evening. His eyes went immediately to the empty space on the tray, and I saw him swallow hard. "What usually stands there, Morrison?" I asked, indicating the telltale square. The butler's professional mask slipped entirely. "A small cordial bottle, sir. For the coffee service. Occasionally we set out essences for those who prefer their beverages flavored." He paused, clearly struggling. "But tonight we were to serve coffee in the morning room, not the conservatory." "The bottle was removed earlier in the day." "And what type of essence was kept in this bottle?" Morrison's silence stretched uncomfortably before he replied, "Almond extract, sir, though I must emphasize that we purchase only the finest quality from Fortnum's. Nothing that could possibly cause harm." Before I could pursue this revelation further, young Ellis appeared in the corridor, his face flushed with obvious distress. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Inspector Japp requires all staff in the drawing room immediately." As we made our way back through the house, Ellis seemed to gather his courage. "Sir," he said in a rush, "about the glasses this evening, there was a bit of confusion during the service. A moth flew into one of them as I was setting the table. I had to swap it for another from the reserve tray." This revelation stopped me in my tracks. "Which glass, Ellis?" The young man's face went crimson. "Mr. de Vere's, sir. It was the last I filled, and the moth went straight to the rim. I took it away, wiped it clean, and replaced it with another. Then I put the cleaned glass back on the reserve tray for future use." He looked miserable. "I was going to mention it to Mr. Morrison, but then everything happened so quickly." In the drawing room, the atmosphere had grown considerably more tense during my absence. Poirot sat in a wing-back chair, apparently absorbed in contemplating the Persian carpet, but I knew this deceptive pose meant he was absorbing every nuance of voice and gesture around him. Inspector Japp stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, methodically working through his preliminary interviews. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot murmured as I entered. "Your timing is most opportune. We have just been discussing the evening service arrangements." Morrison, summoned to give his The Count provided a precise recitation of the dinner's logistics, but when Japp inquired about the sideboard arrangements, his composure faltered noticeably. "The almond essence is removed when not required, Inspector. Tonight it was unnecessary, as coffee was to be served elsewhere." Ellis, called forward next, stammered through his confession about the moth and the switched glasses. His hands twisted nervously as he explained the sequence of events, and I noticed how Poirot's attention sharpened when the young man described wiping the affected glass. "And after you cleaned this glass?" Poirot inquired gently. "Where did you place it?" "On the reserve tray in the pantry, sir. I cannot say which glass Mr. de Vere ultimately received. They were all identical Waterford crystal." With the staff dismissed, Poirot turned his attention to our fellow guests. The transition from the conservatory's strange blue light to the drawing-room's warm amber glow seemed to have restored some measure of normalcy, yet tension crackled beneath the surface of polite conversation. Lady Vivian, maintaining her role as hostess despite the circumstances, answered Poirot's initial questions with admirable composure. "Julian was advising me on several potential acquisitions," she explained, her teacup steady in her hands. He had exceptional taste and remarkable powers of persuasion when it came to convincing collectors to part with their treasures. "And your relationship with Monsieur de Vere, it was purely professional." Poirot's tone remained conversational, but I caught the subtle emphasis. "Of course," Lady Vivian replied, perhaps a touch too quickly, though I confess I had begun to have some reservations about his methods recently. Mrs. Ashworth, who had been sitting rigidly silent throughout the preliminary questioning, suddenly stood and moved to the fireplace. "I cannot continue this charade," she announced, her voice carrying a brittleness that made everyone turn. "Julian de Vere was a blackmailer." The words fell into the elegant room like stones into still water. Miss Penelope gasped audibly, while Colonel Weatherby's military bearing stiffened to attention. Even Monsieur Vallon ceased his nervous fidgeting to stare at Mrs. Ashworth in obvious shock. "Blackmail, madame." Poirot's voice remained perfectly level, but I saw the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated intense interest. Mrs. Ashworth's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. "My late husband's business dealings were not entirely above reproach, Monsieur Poirot. Julian had somehow obtained documentary evidence of certain financial irregularities that would have destroyed Charles' reputation posthumously and left me facing complete social and financial ruin." "And the amount he demanded?" £5,000, a sum I simply could not raise without selling everything I owned. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But tonight, during the fish course, he informed me that he had found a more lucrative arrangement. He would no longer require my payments, as he had secured what he called a far more substantial prize." Dr. Monk, who had been listening with professional detachment, now leaned forward. "Mrs. Ashworth, when Mr. de Vere spoke of this new arrangement, did he seem pleased? Excited?" "Triumphant would be a better word, Doctor. He was practically gloating." She sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every one of her years. "He said he would be making an announcement that would change everything." Poirot rose from his chair with fluid grace, smoothing his waistcoat with characteristic precision. "Most illuminating, madame. Most illuminating indeed." His keen gaze swept the room, taking in each face with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize as the beginning of his most dangerous phase. "It appears, mes amis, that our evening has provided us with a most complex puzzle, one involving missing essences, switched glasses, and secrets that some would kill to protect." The little grey cells, I realized, were already working at full capacity, and somewhere in this elegant drawing-room sat a murderer who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating Hercule Poirot. Mrs. Ashworth's confession seemed to release a pressure valve in the room, and I observed the subtle but unmistakable signs of relief that crossed several faces. Miss Vale was the first to speak, her voice carrying a new note of frankness that had been absent earlier in the evening. "I'm afraid Mrs. Ashworth's revelation comes as no surprise to me," she said, smoothing her evening gloves with practiced precision. Julian had a talent for discovering people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them with considerable charm. He approached me several weeks ago about a supposed indiscretion during my Vienna engagement. Complete fabrication, of course, but he seemed to believe that the mere suggestion of scandal would be enough to secure my cooperation in his schemes. Poirot leaned forward with interest. "And what form did this cooperation take, mademoiselle?" He wanted me to perform at what he called a special exhibition, something that would draw significant attention from both the press and influential collectors. He was quite insistent that my participation would lend the proper social cachet to whatever announcement he was planning. Miss Vale's composure remained intact, but I noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. When I declined, he became rather unpleasant about it. "The handkerchief you observed during the toast," Poirot continued smoothly, "you mentioned it bore the initial J. Could you describe it more precisely?" Miss Vale's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. "White linen, as I said, with a rolled edge and the letter J embroidered in blue silk. Rather fine work, actually. The sort of thing one finds at the better establishments." Inspector Japp chose this moment to return from his examination of the service areas, a constable following behind him carrying several items wrapped in cloth. "Found something interesting in the scullery bin," he announced with evident satisfaction. "Small bottle, label scraped clean, but there's still a whiff of bitter almonds about it. Could be our delivery method." He unwrapped a tiny glass vial, no larger than a perfume sample. "Tucked right at the bottom, under the kitchen scraps." "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, examining the bottle without touching it. "And what else have you discovered, mon ami?" Japp produced a leather wallet and several papers. "From the deceased's person. Marriage settlement draft, drawn up by Sir Reginald's solicitors, naming Miss Penelope Belmont and Julian de Vere. Quite generous terms, though there are amendments in a different hand that seem to favor certain arrangements regarding art holdings rather than the bride's welfare." Lady Vivian's color rose noticeably. He had no authority to meddle in my collection or my stepdaughter's affairs. "There's also this," Japp continued, revealing a small velvet box. Inside lay a magnificent sapphire ring, its deep blue stone seeming to capture and hold the firelight. "Seems our Mr. de Vere was prepared for more than one type of announcement this evening." Miss Penelope gasped softly, her hands flying to her throat. "He never mentioned... we never discussed..." She broke off, clearly overwhelmed by the implications. Dr. Monk, observing his patient with professional concern, spoke quietly. "Mr. de Vere did approach me several weeks ago about Miss Penelope's trust arrangements. He seemed remarkably well informed about the terms of Sir Reginald's will and the procedures required for early access to her inheritance. I found his interest somewhat presumptuous at the time." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Presumptuous, you say? In what manner?" He spoke as if the marriage were already a settled matter, requiring only the proper legal formalities. He was particularly interested in the provisions regarding Lady Vivian's art collection and how they might be affected by Miss Penelope's change in status. Dr. Monk glanced apologetically at Lady Vivian. I took the liberty of advising him that such matters were not his concern. "Quite right, Doctor," Lady Vivian said firmly, though I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her teacup. Julian had developed an unseemly fascination with Reginald's collection. He seemed to believe that his expertise entitled him to make decisions about pieces that have been in our family for generations. Japp consulted his notebook with evident satisfaction. "Well, that gives us motive aplenty. Blackmail, inheritance, art fraud, and a rejected marriage proposal. As for means and opportunity, young Ellis admits to handling the glasses, has access to the service areas, and we've found the poison bottle conveniently disposed of in his workplace." He looked around the room with the air of a man who considered the case essentially solved. "I'll be taking him in for formal questioning." Monsieur l'inspecteur, Poirot interjected gently, you have indeed assembled the facts with admirable efficiency. But tell me, what motive would this young man have for committing murder? The risk of the gallows is considerable. Surely there must be some compelling reason. Japp's confidence wavered slightly. Well, perhaps De Vere caught him stealing, or maybe the lad was being paid by someone else. These domestic murders aren't always complicated, Poirot. Perhaps not, Poirot agreed mildly. But this particular crime required not only access and opportunity, but also considerable knowledge of chemistry, perfect timing, and nerves of steel. The prussic acid had to be applied to the glass at precisely the right moment to maintain its potency, and the killer had to be certain that the victim would receive the poisoned vessel. He turned to Morrison, who had been standing quietly by the door. A question about household linens, if you please. Who among our guests tonight might have access to monogrammed handkerchiefs bearing the initial J? Morrison's professional composure flickered slightly. An unusual question, sir. Mr. De Vere's personal linen bore his own initial naturally. But we do occasionally have items mixed in our laundry from guests who stay for extended periods. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. Miss Vale's maid did return several items to our linen press this afternoon, including what appeared to be a gentleman's handkerchief that didn't belong to our usual inventory. Miss Vale's composure remained perfect, but I caught the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. The laundries in London are notoriously unreliable, she said smoothly. One's linens are constantly being mixed up with those of other patrons. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, mademoiselle. And yet, how curious that such a handkerchief should appear and disappear with such convenient timing. His gaze swept the room, taking in each face with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. The psychology of this crime fascinates me, mes amis. The killer chose a method that was both theatrical and precise. Poison applied in full view of witnesses, yet invisible in its execution. This suggests someone with not only the necessary knowledge and access, but also a flair for the dramatic. As Inspector Japp prepared to arrest young Ellis, I could see that Poirot's little grey cells were working at full capacity, assembling the scattered pieces of this complex puzzle. The first false lead was about to emerge, but I had the distinct feeling that our Belgian friend was already several steps ahead of the official investigation, following a trail of psychological clues that would lead to a very different conclusion. As Inspector Japp moved decisively toward the door to summon his constables, Poirot rose from his chair, with that deceptive casualness I had learned to recognize as a warning signal. His small, precise hands smoothed his waistcoat with characteristic attention to detail, and when he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority that had halted many a premature conclusion. Mon ami Japp, if you would permit me just one small moment before you proceed. Poirot's tone remained perfectly courteous, yet something in its quiet certainty made the inspector pause with his hand on the door handle. There are certain details that trouble the little grey cells, insignificant perhaps to the official mind, but worthy of consideration nonetheless. Japp, who had worked with Poirot long enough to respect his instincts despite their frequent professional disagreements, reluctantly closed his notebook. 5 minutes, Poirot, but the evidence is clear as daylight. Means, motive, and opportunity all point squarely at the servant. Ah, but do they indeed? Poirot moved to the center of the drawing room, his keen gaze sweeping over each face with renewed intensity. Consider, if you please, the psychology of this particular crime. Young Ellis, if he were truly our murderer, would have required access to prussic acid, no simple matter for a household servant. More critically, he would have needed to know precisely which glass Monsieur de Vere would receive. Despite the considerable confusion caused by the moth incident and the subsequent switching of the vessels. Ellis, standing pale and trembling near the doorway, looked up with desperate hope as Poirot continued his methodical analysis. But most importantly of all, Poirot said, his voice taking on that lecturing quality I knew so well, He would have had to apply the poison at exactly the correct moment to maintain its lethal potency. Dr. Monk, you will confirm that hydrocyanic acid in the concentration required for such rapid effect loses its power very quickly, particularly in a warm environment. Dr. Monk nodded gravely. Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, the timing would be absolutely critical. Too early, and the acid would evaporate or be detected by its distinctive scent. Too late, and the opportunity would be lost entirely. Precisely so, Doctor. Poirot agreed with evident satisfaction. The poison had to be introduced mere minutes, perhaps even seconds, before consumption. Yet Ellis admits to being in the pantry when the toast was proposed. How, then, could he have accomplished this feat of precise timing? Miss Penelope, who had been sitting quietly throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke with unexpected clarity. Ellis couldn't have known about the handkerchief either. When Julian wrapped it around the glass stem and dabbed his lip, Ellis had already returned to the service areas. I watched him leave after pouring the wine. Exactly so, mademoiselle, Poirot said with warm approval. The handkerchief appears to have been crucial to our killer's methodology, yet young Ellis could not possibly have anticipated its use. He turned to Miss Vale, his expression thoughtful. This handkerchief that you observed with such precision, you remain certain it bore the initial J? Miss Vale maintained her composure admirably, though I detected the slightest hesitation before she replied. Quite certain, Monsieur Poirot. The blue embroidery was rather distinctive against the white linen. And yet, Poirot continued with deceptive mildness, Morrison has informed us that precisely such a handkerchief was returned to the household laundry this very afternoon. Most curious timing. Would you not agree? The atmosphere in the drawing room grew perceptibly more tense. Poirot moved toward the evidence table where de Vere's personal effects lay displayed, selecting a clean sherry glass and holding it delicately by its base. Observe, mes amis, he said, his voice taking on that demonstrative quality that signaled one of his famous reconstructions. If the poison were applied directly to the rim of the glass, the act would be bold and visible to any observer. But consider an alternative. Suppose the poison were concealed upon something else, something that would naturally come into contact with the victim's lips during the act of drinking. He held the glass aloft, mimicking the gesture of a toast. A handkerchief wrapped around the stem, ostensibly to protect the hand or dab the lip, could easily brush against the rim during the drinking motion. A single touch. Only that, and the deed would be accomplished without a single suspicious movement visible to the witnesses. Colonel Weatherby cleared his throat with military precision. See here, Poirot, are you suggesting that one of us— I suggest nothing yet, mon colonel, Poirot replied gently. I merely observe that this crime required intimate knowledge of household routines, access to both service areas and dining arrangements, and, most critically, the ability to predict or control which glass the victim would ultimately receive. Lady Vivian's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. Surely you cannot be implying that one of my guests would resort to such methods, Monsieur Poirot. I imply only that we must consider all possibilities, madame, Poirot replied diplomatically. The killer demonstrated remarkable sang-froid in executing this crime under the direct observation of 8 witnesses. Such composure suggests someone well accustomed to performance, to maintaining perfect appearances under considerable pressure. At this, Miss Vale's laugh carried a note of forced lightness. How theatrical you make it sound, Monsieur Poirot. Though I suppose anyone who performs regularly does develop a certain ability to control their nerves under scrutiny. Indeed, mademoiselle. Poirot agreed, his gaze sharpening almost imperceptibly. The ability to perform convincingly while concealing one's true intentions is both rare and valuable. It was then that Monsieur Vallon, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this discussion, suddenly burst out with obvious distress. But surely this is impossible. We were all present, all watching the toast. How could anyone poison a glass without being observed by someone? An excellent question, monsieur. Poirot replied with perfect calm, and yet it was unquestionably accomplished. The poison was applied, the victim consumed it, and he died within moments of our collective observation. The method may have been invisible to us, but the tragic result was all too evident. He paused, then added with particular emphasis, "I understand from Lady Vivian that Monsieur de Vere had developed quite strong opinions about the authenticity of certain pieces in the Belmont collection. Perhaps you, as an artist, could enlighten us about his specific concerns." Vallon's hands trembled slightly as he replied. Julian fancied himself quite the connoisseur. He spoke often of a particular painting, a work by a Belgian artist that he claimed was a masterful forgery. He threatened to expose what he called systematic deception in the collection unless certain arrangements were made regarding Miss Penelope's inheritance. A subtle but unmistakable shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. Lady Vivian had gone quite pale, while Dr. Monk's professional attention seemed to sharpen considerably. Inspector Japp, growing impatient with these philosophical discussions, consulted his pocket watch with obvious irritation. "Right then, Poirot. You've had your 5 minutes and more. Unless you can produce concrete evidence pointing elsewhere, I'm proceeding with the arrest as planned." "Ah, but evidence is precisely what we must examine with greater care," Poirot said, moving back toward the fireplace. "The little grey cells prefer order, mon ami, and there are still several pieces of this puzzle that refuse to fit together properly." He smiled with that particular expression I knew meant his mind was working at full capacity. "Perhaps tomorrow morning, when we have had time to reflect upon all we have learned, the truth will reveal itself with greater clarity." As we prepared to leave the drawing-room, Poirot caught my arm and murmured quietly, "You see it beginning to emerge, Hastings. The mind that delights in performance, the confidence to commit murder in plain sight of 8 witnesses. This is no frightened servant acting in panic. This is someone who lives by controlling appearances and manipulating perceptions. Someone for whom the entire world is a stage." The psychological game, I realized, was far from over. Indeed, with Ellis temporarily spared from arrest, the real performance was only just beginning. The evening had grown late, but Poirot showed no inclination to dismiss our gathering. Instead, with that mixture of courtesy and quiet authority that always compels obedience, he proposed that we return to the conservatory for what he termed a brief reconstruction of events. Lady Vivian assented, though I observed the quick exchange of anxious glances between Mrs. Ashworth and Miss Vale as we made our way back through the corridors to that cathedral of blue glass. In the strange sapphire glow, we took our former places around the table, the chairs positioned exactly where they had been when de Vere raised his fatal toast. The shattered crystal had been carefully removed, and the marble floor scrubbed clean, yet I fancied the blue light still held some memory of the tragedy that had unfolded here. The fountain continued its gentle music, but now it seemed to carry an undertone of melancholy that had been absent during our earlier, more innocent gathering. "Each of you will recall the precise position of your glass," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying easily through the crystalline space. "Morrison, if you would be so kind as to provide identical empty goblets for our demonstration." He paused meaningfully, "Not to drink naturellement, but to remember." As Morrison arranged the crystal glasses with his customary precision, Poirot stood behind de Vere's vacant chair, looking down upon it with a grave expression that seemed to encompass both pity and professional interest. He lifted one of the spare glasses by its stem, holding it with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all his movements. "Now we shall reproduce what Monsieur de Vere did in his final moments," Poirot announced, his tone taking on that demonstrative quality I recognized from his previous reconstructions. The raising of the glass, the wrapping of the handkerchief around the stem. But we require the proper prop for our little drama. Miss Vale, with what appeared to be helpful spontaneity, reached into her reticule and produced a square of white linen. "If it would assist your demonstration, Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending the handkerchief with a half-smile that seemed perfectly natural. Poirot inclined his head courteously, but made no move to accept the offered item. Instead, he turned to Morrison with apparent casualness. "There is one of particular interest in the household linen press, is there not? A gentleman's handkerchief bearing a blue embroidered initial J that was returned to your care this very afternoon. Perhaps you would retrieve it for our examination, along with the key to the press." Morrison departed with his usual efficiency and returned promptly bearing both the folded handkerchief and a small ring of household keys. Poirot accepted the linen between two fingertips, taking great care not to touch the embroidered monogram directly. "Observe, mes amis," he said, his voice carrying that lecturing quality that signaled an important demonstration. "When folded thus around the stem of the glass, one's hand appears merely to be protecting the crystal from moisture or providing a more secure grip. Most natural, most innocent in appearance." He mimed the motion of dabbing at his lip with the handkerchief, then allowed it to brush lightly against the rim of the glass. The movement was so fluid, so perfectly ordinary, that it seemed like nothing at all. Yet there was something chilling in its very simplicity. Dr. Monk, watching the demonstration with professional attention, gave a grunt of understanding. "Yes, I see it now. If the cloth carried the agent in its folds, a single contact with the rim would suffice. The evaporation would be minimized within the fabric until the moment of application." "Precisely so, Doctor," Poirot agreed with evident satisfaction. He placed the handkerchief carefully upon a side table, ensuring it touched nothing else. "Morrison, kindly return this evidence to the linen press and secure it with the key. Inspector Japp will apply his official seal to ensure its integrity until morning." Japp produced a strip of sealing wax and pressed it with his signet ring across the lock mechanism. "There," he announced with professional satisfaction. "If anyone attempts to tamper with this evidence, we shall know immediately." The reconstruction continued with Poirot requesting each of us to demonstrate the toasting motion as De Vere had performed it. In that ethereal blue light, even the smallest gestures took on an unsettling intensity. Miss Penelope's fingers trembled visibly as she raised her glass, while Colonel Weatherby's military bearing stiffened with obvious discomfort at the macabre exercise. Miss Vale performed the motion with a singer's natural poise, her wrist supple and graceful, her smile remaining perfectly composed. Only Monsieur Vallon's hand shook noticeably as he participated in the grim pantomime. "And now," Poirot announced, replacing the demonstration glass with characteristic precision, "we must consider the dual nature of Monsieur de Vere's intended announcements. One concerned matters of the heart, as evidenced by the engagement ring found in his possession. The other, however, had considerably sharper teeth. His claims regarding the authenticity of certain artworks in the Belmont collection." Lady Vivian's fan snapped open with audible force. "This is becoming quite intolerable, Monsieur Poirot. Surely these theatrical demonstrations serve no useful purpose." "On the contrary, madame," he replied with unshakable calm, "they serve to illuminate the psychology of our criminal. By morning, I believe all will become considerably clearer." He turned to Inspector Japp with renewed authority. "Mon ami, I suggest you place a constable at the entrance to the picture gallery. No one is to examine the artwork in question without official supervision." As our strange gathering finally dispersed, the storm that had been threatening all evening pressed close against the great glass panes, making the conservatory seem like a vessel adrift in dark waters. Poirot drew me aside in the corridor, his expression carrying that particular intensity I had learned to recognize as a sign of approaching resolution. "You perceive it, Hastings?" he murmured quietly. "The mind at work, the compulsive need to control every aspect of the narrative. Tonight I have tugged at certain strings of this web of deception. Let us observe which puppet feels compelled to move." "You believe the handkerchief will prove irresistible to someone," I ventured. "But naturally, mon ami," he replied with quiet confidence. "If the evidence is truly innocuous, There exists no danger in allowing it to remain for official examination. If, however, it carries the proof of guilt, well, then every moment of its continued existence represents mortal peril to our murderer. His keen gaze flickered toward the shadowed end of the passage. You will take a chair and position yourself discreetly near the linen press. Watch only. Do not attempt to intervene should anyone approach. Simply come to fetch me immediately. I followed his instructions, settling into a small chair positioned where I could observe the sealed evidence while remaining largely concealed in the corridor's shadows. The great house quieted by degrees as the night deepened. Distant doors closed with muffled finality. Voices dwindled to whispers and then silence, and somewhere a carriage rolled away from the front entrance with the sound of wheels on wet gravel. The corridor near the linen press carried the faint, comforting sense of starch and lavender that spoke of proper household management. I confess that the late hour and emotional strain of the evening made my eyelids grow heavy more than once. The quarter hours chimed with mechanical regularity from some distant clock, marking the slow passage of time toward whatever resolution Poirot's trap might bring. It was approaching 2 o'clock when I heard the soft whisper of careful footsteps, a measured tread that paused between floorboards as if counting them for maximum silence. A slender figure moved within the shadows at the corridor's turn, wrapped in a dark dressing gown that rendered them nearly invisible in the dim light. I caught the pale oval of a hand, the metallic glint of a small key, and held my breath as the figure approached the sealed linen press. The intruder stopped before the evidence locker, bending to examine Inspector Japp's seal with delicate fingertips. I rose too quickly in my excitement, my chair scraping against the wainscoting with a small but audible sound. The figure's head turned sharply toward the noise. I glimpsed the startled flash of eyes in the darkness, and then there was a flurry of swift, silent movement. By the time I reached the linen press, the corridor stretched empty before me, holding only the faintest whisper of expensive perfume lingering in the still air. The wax seal lay on the floor in 2 precisely separated halves. Not torn clumsily, but lifted with the practiced skill of someone familiar with such delicate work. The small key had been used with expert precision to raise the wax without damaging the underlying tape, leaving no evidence of clumsy haste. The press door stood slightly ajar, and when I peered inside, the top shelf where Morrison had carefully placed the handkerchief beneath a folded bath sheet was conspicuously empty. The evidence had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. I ran to Poirot's room with as much haste as stealth would allow. He opened the door at my first quiet knock, fully dressed and alert, as if he had never intended to sleep at all during this crucial night. "So, Hastings?" he inquired with quiet intensity. "Gone," I reported breathlessly. The seal lifted with professional skill, the handkerchief stolen completely. Poirot's eyes sparkled with a light that was not joy, but the deep satisfaction of confirmed deduction. "Bon," he murmured with evident pleasure. "The mask begins to crack at last." He reached for his hat with meticulous care, smoothing its brim with characteristic attention to detail. "Come, mon ami. We must wake Inspector Japp immediately. Our murderer has been kind enough to provide us with a second crime, one that will prove far more revealing than the first." As we made our way through the sleeping house toward Japp's quarters, I realized that Poirot's psychological game had achieved exactly the result he had anticipated. The killer's need to control every aspect of their carefully constructed deception had proven stronger than their instinct for self-preservation, and in yielding to that compulsion, they had provided the very evidence that would ensure their downfall. Inspector Japp's reaction to our midnight summons was predictably explosive, though he managed to keep his voice to a furious whisper as we explained the theft of the crucial evidence. His hair stood at uncharacteristic angles, and his nightshirt bore the rumpled testament to interrupted sleep. Yet his professional instincts engaged immediately upon seeing the violated seal. "Professional work, this," he muttered grimly, examining the separated pieces of wax with his magnifying glass. The seal had been lifted with surgical precision, not torn or forced, but separated with what appeared to be a warmed blade that had slid cleanly beneath the wax without disturbing the underlying tape. Someone who's handled official seals before, or at least observed the process closely enough to replicate it perfectly. Poirot nodded with evident satisfaction, his keen nostrils flaring slightly as he bent closer to the empty press. "And observe, mon ami, there lingers still a scent that does not belong to starch and lavender. Something floral yet complex, gardenia perhaps, or one of those French compositions that borrows from it." I caught the faintest thread of expensive perfume upon the air, elusive as a memory, yet unmistakably present. The discovery sent ripples of activity through the household. Japp dispatched constables to secure both ends of the corridor, while Morrison was roused to account for his keys. The butler's mortification was genuine and complete. He swore upon his professional reputation that the key ring had never left his person, save for the 2 minutes when he had entrusted it to the night footman at Japp's own request. "The psychology of this act fascinates me," Poirot murmured as we made our systematic examination of the guest quarters. Each heavy oak door stood properly closed, no light visible beneath the thresholds, yet I found myself studying them with new intensity. Our criminal possesses not only the nerve to commit murder under direct observation, but also the technical knowledge to defeat official security measures. Most illuminating. We moved quietly through the house, checking each room with methodical precision. The faint scent of expensive perfume seemed to follow us through the corridors, a ghostly signature left by our midnight intruder. Lady Vivian's suite occupied the corner position, with Mrs. Ashworth directly adjacent and Miss Vale's room across the hall. Dr. Monk had been given quarters near Miss Penelope's chamber for medical convenience, while Colonel Weatherby and Monsieur Vallon occupied the wing's opposite end. "The disposal of contaminated evidence presents a most interesting problem," Poirot observed as we completed our circuit. "A handkerchief bearing traces of prussic acid cannot simply be burned in a bedroom fireplace. The toxic fumes would pose considerable danger to the destroyer. Nor can it be safely hidden among personal belongings, as discovery would mean certain conviction." The answer came to me with sudden clarity. "The conservatory," I suggested, remembering Lady Vivian's extensive plant collection. "The gardening supplies would include acids for soil treatment, compounds for pest control, all manner of chemicals that could dissolve organic materials completely." "Excellent reasoning, Hastings," Poirot agreed, his eyes sparkling with approval. "A handkerchief dissolved in horticultural acid would leave no trace whatsoever, and the presence of such chemicals would excite no comment from the household staff." We made our way back through the service corridors to that cathedral of blue glass. The conservatory at night possessed an entirely different character from the elegant dining venue we had known earlier. Without the warm glow of dinner candles, the blue-tinted glass created an underwater atmosphere that was both beautiful and faintly menacing. Exotic palms cast strange shadows in the moonlight, their tropical forms seeming to writhe and shift as clouds moved across the sky. Behind a screen of tall palms, we discovered the gardening area where Lady Vivian's staff maintained her spectacular collection. Neat rows of bottles and containers lined wooden shelves, each clearly labeled with contents and usage instructions. The sharp scent of various chemicals hung in the air, fertilizers, fungicides, and soil treatments that spoke of serious horticultural endeavor. Japp's electric torch revealed telltale signs of recent activity. A large brown bottle marked muriatic acid. Soil treatment showed evidence of recent disturbance, and nearby on the potting bench lay a damp cloth that reeked of chemical dissolution. Small droplets of acid had etched tiny marks in the wooden surface, and the acrid smell made our eyes water, even in the open air. "Most convenient for our criminal," Poirot observed, bending to examine the evidence without touching it. "Yet also most incriminating. The destruction of evidence often provides more proof of guilt than the evidence itself would have done." He straightened, his expression thoughtful. This confirms what the little grey cells suspected. We are dealing with someone who values control above all else, yet cannot resist the theatrical gesture even in their most desperate moments. As we prepared to return to the house, Poirot caught my arm with that characteristic gesture that indicated important reflection. "You perceive the pattern, Hastings. The professional seal lifting, the precise chemical disposal, the faint signature of expensive perfume, all speak of someone accustomed to performance, to maintaining perfect appearances under considerable pressure. This is no frightened servant acting in panic, but a mind that delights in complexity and control." Japp consulted his pocket watch with obvious frustration. Nearly 3 o'clock, and we're chasing shadows through a greenhouse. The handkerchief's gone, dissolved into nothing, and we're no closer to our killer. "On the contrary, mon ami," Poirot replied with quiet confidence. "A criminal has been most cooperative. By removing the evidence, they have confirmed its significance beyond any doubt. Had the handkerchief been truly innocuous, there would have been no need for such elaborate disposal. The act itself is a confession, one written in perfume and acid, rather than ink." As we made our way back through the sleeping house, Poirot walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his egg-shaped head tilted in characteristic contemplation. "Tomorrow, when the household gathers in daylight, we shall observe who among our suspects shows signs of a sleepless night, whose hands bear the faint traces of chemical contact, whose composure seems perhaps too perfect for someone who should be shocked by a second crime." The storm continued to press against the great windows, making the house seem like a vessel adrift in dark waters. Somewhere in these elegant rooms slept a murderer who had made the fatal mistake of believing they could outmaneuver Hercule Poirot through theatrical cunning alone. The psychological game was entering its most dangerous phase, and I had the distinct feeling that our Belgian friend was already several moves ahead of his opponent. "The mind that commits murder in full view of 8 witnesses," Poirot murmured as we reached our quarters, "is the same mind that cannot resist returning to admire its handiwork. Tomorrow, Hastings, we shall provide our criminal with one final opportunity to demonstrate their artistic temperament, and in doing so, they will complete the pattern that will ensure their downfall." Dawn brought little relief from the storm that had battered the house throughout the night, and the grey morning light filtering through the breakfast room's rain-streaked windows seemed to strip away the previous evening's ethereal mystery, replacing it with stark, uncomfortable reality. The cheerful yellow wallpaper and delicate spode china appeared almost defiant against the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Lady Vivian's elegant home. Yet I found myself studying each face with new intensity, searching for the telltale signs Poirot had predicted would mark our midnight intruder. The household assembled with the conspicuous politeness of people determined to behave well in the face of catastrophe. Yet the strain showed in countless small details. Miss Vale appeared impeccably groomed, despite the early hour, her hair arranged with professional precision and her morning dress showing not the slightest wrinkle, yet when she reached for her teacup, I noticed the faintest tremor in her fingers. Mrs. Ashworth looked every one of her years, with shadows beneath her eyes and a pallor that no amount of powder could entirely conceal. Dr. Monk attended to Miss Penelope with his usual professional solicitude, though I observed him watching the other guests with clinical interest. Colonel Weatherby maintained his military bearing, but his customary ruddy complexion had given way to an ashen grey that spoke of disturbed sleep and troubled thoughts. Monsieur Vallon appeared the most obviously affected by our midnight drama, his hands shaking as he attempted to butter his toast, starting visibly when Morrison entered to refill the coffee service. Lady Vivian, playing hostess with determined grace, maintained perfect composure, yet I caught her glancing repeatedly toward the windows as if seeking escape from the tension that crackled beneath the surface of polite conversation. Poirot entered precisely at 8 o'clock, his appearance immaculate despite our late-night activities. He moved through the breakfast room with characteristic precision, accepting coffee from Morrison and settling into his chair with that deceptive casualness I had learned to recognize as intense concentration. Inspector Japp followed shortly after, his professional demeanor intact, though his eyes carried the gritty look of insufficient sleep. "Ladies and gentlemen," Japp announced without preamble, consulting his notebook with evident satisfaction, "I must inform you that during the night, crucial evidence in Mr. de Vere's murder was stolen from secured storage. The handkerchief that several of you observed during the fatal toast has been removed and destroyed using chemical means found in the conservatory's gardening supplies." The reactions were immediate and telling. Miss Vale's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, while Mrs. Ashworth's face went completely white. Dr. Monk leaned forward with professional interest, and Colonel Weatherby's military posture stiffened to attention. Most revealing of all was Monsieur Vallon's response. He actually dropped his toast, sending crumbs scattering across the pristine tablecloth. Poirot chose this moment to speak, his voice carrying that gentle authority that always commanded attention. "The psychology of this act fascinates me greatly," he observed, dabbing his lips with characteristic precision. "To steal evidence requires not only physical access and technical skill, but also intimate knowledge of its significance. Our criminal understood exactly what that handkerchief represented, and why its continued existence posed mortal danger to their carefully constructed deception." He paused to sip his coffee, his keen gaze moving systematically around the table, lingering momentarily on hands, noting the slight flushing about Mrs. Ashworth's knuckles that might indicate recent contact with harsh soaps, the perfect manicure of Miss Vale's fingers positioned carefully to avoid direct light, the telltale marks on Dr. Monk's hands that spoke of frequent washing. The seal was lifted with professional expertise. Poirot continued thoughtfully, suggesting familiarity with official procedures. The chemical disposal required knowledge of horticultural acids and their proper handling. Most tellingly, the theft occurred at precisely the moment when such action became necessary to prevent exposure. His eyes sparkled with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize. No, mes amis, this was not the desperate act of a frightened servant, but the calculated move of someone accustomed to performance under pressure. Someone for whom maintaining perfect appearances is both profession and obsession. Miss Vale's laugh carried a note of forced lightness that seemed to ring hollow in the morning room's tense atmosphere. "How dramatic you make it sound, Monsieur Poirot, though I suppose anyone who performs regularly does develop a certain ability to maintain composure under scrutiny." "Indeed, mademoiselle," he agreed with particular emphasis, his gaze sharpening almost imperceptibly. "The ability to perform convincingly while concealing one's true intentions is both rare and valuable. It requires not only natural talent, but extensive practice in controlling every aspect of one's presentation to the world." It was then that Morrison approached Poirot with obvious reluctance, bending to murmur something in his ear that made the little detective's eyebrows rise with interest. Poirot nodded gravely and turned back to our assembled company. "Ah, but we are not without consolation," he announced with evident satisfaction. "Though the handkerchief has been dissolved, it is not entirely vanished. Morrison has discovered fiber remnants in the drainage trap of the potting bench where acid and water mingle. These will reveal something of their origin, perhaps even a foreign thread from a repair or the characteristic starch of a particular laundry." Lady Vivian's fan snapped open with audible force. "Surely this proves that one of the servants must be responsible, Monsieur Poirot. Who else would have such detailed knowledge of household routines and access to the service areas?" "An interesting theory, madame," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "Yet it fails to address several crucial points. Consider the timing. The theft occurred within hours of our reconstruction, suggesting someone who understood not merely what the handkerchief was, but why its continued existence had become suddenly dangerous." He rose from his chair with fluid grace, smoothing his waistcoat with characteristic attention to detail. The mind that commits murder, in full view of 8 witnesses, is the same mind that cannot resist returning to admire its handiwork, to ensure that every detail of the performance remains under perfect control. He moved toward the doorway, then paused with that theatrical timing I'd observed in so many of his previous cases. "We shall gather again at noon, mes amis, in the conservatory where this tragedy began. I will ask each of you to bring one personal item that you kept about you last night. A glove, a scarf, a handkerchief, a cigarette case. A harmless exercise, you understand, to satisfy a small curiosity of mine." His eyes grew very bright as they swept over our faces. For I believe the little grey cells are finally ready to reveal the complete pattern of this most ingenious deception. As we prepared to disperse, I caught the faintest tightening at the corner of Miss Vale's mouth, the rigid set of Mrs. Ashworth's shoulders, the desolate confusion in Miss Penelope's eyes, and the odd calculating stillness of Monsieur Vallon. The psychological game was entering its most dangerous phase, and somewhere in this elegant breakfast room sat a murderer who had made the fatal mistake of believing they could outmaneuver Hercule Poirot through theatrical cunning alone. The final gathering was approaching, and with it, the moment when all deceptions would be stripped away to reveal the truth that lay beneath the sapphire light of the House of Blue Glass. Noon found us once more beneath the sapphire vault of the conservatory, the storm's last rumbles receding into sullen distance. The blue light seemed different now, less ethereal, more clinical, as it pooled around us like water while Morrison arranged a low table near the fountain. At Poirot's quiet request, we had each brought a personal item from the previous evening. Lady Vivian's ivory fan, Mrs. Ashworth's lace-edged handkerchief, Dr. Monk's polished cigarette case, Colonel Weatherby's leather gloves, Monsieur Vallon's paint-stained scarf, Miss Penelope's silver locket, and Miss Vale's powder compact, alongside a pair of white kid gloves tied with ribbon. Inspector Japp positioned himself near the entrance, a constable at each door, his expression carrying the grim satisfaction of a man who sensed resolution approaching. The blue light transformed us all into figures in an aquatic dream. Yet I noticed how Poirot's keen eyes seemed unaffected by the strange illumination, as if he alone could see through the colored glass to the truth beneath. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying easily through the crystalline space, "we gather to examine not merely objects, but the psychology they reveal. Each item tells a story, not only of its owner, but of the careful habits that define us." He moved with characteristic precision to the table, his small hands hovering over the assembled items like a conductor preparing his orchestra. He lifted Lady Vivian's fan first, admiring its ivory workmanship before laying it down with exactness. The cigarette case received similar attention. He tested its weight, noted the polish wear that indicated Dr. Monk's left-handed nature, returned it precisely to its position. When he unfolded Mrs. Ashworth's handkerchief, spreading it across the velvet with the gentleness reserved for priceless porcelain, the lace trembled slightly under his breath, while Mrs. Ashworth herself trembled considerably more. "You perceive, mes amis," he said, his voice taking on that lecturing quality I knew so well, "how each of us arranges the world to our liking. Even in small things, the pressing of a crease, the smoothing of a fold, the way one returns an object to its place, our natures declare themselves." His gaze flickered meaningfully to Miss Vale's gloves. Control and its little rituals. Colonel Weatherby's gloves revealed the faint residue of polish, harmless military habits. Vallon's scarf carried the expected scent of turpentine, earning a strained laugh from its owner when Poirot commented on artists and their perfumes. But when he reached Miss Vale's items, his examination grew more deliberate. "Mademoiselle, your gloves. They are most exquisite. Kid of the finest quality, no?" He turned them beneath the blue light, then angled them so that natural daylight from a clear panel fell across the pale leather. "So delicate, yet the smallest thing leaves its mark. You see, Hastings, Where the glove meets the forefinger seam, there is the faintest bloom, as if something once dulled the finish and has since been buffed away. Miss Vale's composure remained perfect, though I caught the almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of her mouth. A performer's hands endure many trials, Monsieur Poirot. Stage makeup, costume jewelry, all manner of theatrical necessities. Indeed, he agreed, examining her compact with apparent casualness. The gold surface caught the blue light and split it into prismatic shards before he set it aside. Morrison, he continued, you mentioned yesterday that the household's finer linens are sent to a firm in Jermyn Street. Yes, sir. They use a particular lavender French sizing that leaves a distinctive finish. Poirot nodded with evident satisfaction. Most illuminating. You see, the fibers recovered from the potting bench drainage carry traces of this same sizing, a signature that survives even acid dissolution. He paused, allowing this revelation to settle over our assembled company. One does not leap to conclusions. One walks step by step, following the trail of evidence. His attention returned to the blue light filtering through the conservatory's walls, and suddenly his expression brightened with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize as breakthrough. But perhaps most fascinating of all is what this colored glass has hidden from us. Blue light, mes amis, alters everything it touches. Crimson appears black, green masquerades as gray, and dark embroidery may seem lighter than truth. The implication struck me like a physical blow. Miss Vale's confident description of blue embroidery on the fatal handkerchief. What if the actual thread had been a different color entirely, transformed by the conservatory's sapphire illumination? A detail everyone believes they saw, Poirot continued with quiet emphasis, may not be what it seemed. The psychology of this fascinates me. A witness so certain of what they observed that they describe it with perfect confidence, never realizing the glass itself was the deceiver. Miss Vale's perfect poise flickered for just an instant, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that spoke volumes to anyone trained to read such signs. The psychological pressure was mounting with each methodical revelation, each carefully placed piece of evidence that built toward an inescapable conclusion. At 6 o'clock, Poirot announced, stepping back with his hands folded in characteristic contemplation, we shall assemble here once more. Inspector Japp will have the complete fiber analysis, Morrison will bring the laundry ledgers, and we shall examine certain matters in the picture gallery that Monsieur de Vere meant to reveal. Matters that will show us not what a man planned, but who feared that plan most desperately. As we prepared to disperse, I felt the air crackle with anticipation. Poirot had not yet accused, but he had arranged every piece with surgical precision. The little gray cells were clearly working at full capacity, and somewhere in this elegant conservatory sat a murderer who was beginning to realize that their perfect performance was about to face its final, most critical audience. The psychological game was entering its most dangerous phase, and I had the distinct feeling that the next gathering would bring the complete unraveling of a deception that had been planned with theatrical brilliance, yet executed with one fatal miscalculation, underestimating the methodical genius of Hercule Poirot. 6 o'clock found us assembled once more beneath the great vault of blue glass, the day's last light filtering through the sapphire panes with a clarity that seemed to strip away all pretense. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and cold, and in that crystalline atmosphere, Poirot stood with characteristic precision near the fountain, his small figure radiating quiet authority. Inspector Japp positioned himself by the entrance, a folder of official reports in his hands, while Morrison hovered at the periphery with the household ledgers. Each of our suspects occupied the same chair they had held during that fatal dinner. Yet now, the elegant seating arrangement felt more like a tribunal where final judgment would be rendered. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice carrying easily through the conservatory's crystalline space, we gathered to conclude a most tragic affair, A man has been murdered in full view of 8 witnesses, yet the method was so ingenious, so perfectly adapted to this unique setting, that none observed the fatal blow being struck. His keen gaze swept over each face with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. The little grey cells have worked diligently to bring order to what appeared to be chaos, and now they are ready to reveal the complete pattern of this most theatrical deception. He moved with fluid grace to stand behind de Vere's vacant chair, his hands resting lightly on its carved back. The method was both simple and brilliant. Prussic acid applied to the rim of a wine glass, using a handkerchief as the delivery mechanism. The poison, concealed within the folds of the fabric, remained stable until the moment of contact. One brush against the glass rim, one sip of wine, and death followed within seconds. Poirot lifted an empty crystal goblet from the table, holding it with the same careful attention that characterized all his movements. But the true genius lay not in the method itself, but in its perfect adaptation to this extraordinary setting. You see, mes amis, the House of Blue Glass became an unwitting accomplice to murder, transforming not only light and shadow, but the very evidence itself. Inspector Japp opened his folder with evident satisfaction. The fiber analysis confirms what Monsieur Poirot suspected. The handkerchief recovered from the drainage trap bore traces of both prussic acid and the distinctive French sizing used by the Jermyn Street establishment. But most significantly, the embroidery thread was not blue as described by our witness. Precisely so, Poirot agreed, his eyes sparkling with that particular intensity that signaled complete understanding. The monogram was embroidered in deep crimson silk, a color that under this conservatory's sapphire illumination appears distinctly blue to the human eye. Our witness described what they genuinely believed they had observed, never realizing that the blue glass itself had created an optical illusion of devastating consequence. A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. Monsieur Vallon, who had been sitting rigidly in his chair, seemed to shrink visibly as Poirot's gaze fell upon him with unmistakable focus. The handkerchief bore the initial J. Poirot continued with relentless logic, which we naturally assumed stood for Julien de Vere. Yet this assumption, while logical, was incorrect. The J represented another name entirely, one that connects directly to the motive for this carefully planned murder. He paused, allowing the tension to build with theatrical precision. It stood for Jacques Vallon, the professional name under which Monsieur René Vallon has been creating masterful forgeries of classical works for the past 15 years. Vallon's face went completely white, his hands trembling as they gripped the arms of his chair. "No, you cannot prove." "But I can prove it, mon ami," Poirot interrupted gently. Monsieur de Vere had discovered the truth about several pieces in Lady Vivienne's collection, works that were not ancient masterpieces but contemporary creations painted in classical styles by a living artist of extraordinary skill. He had obtained documentary evidence of your true identity and was prepared to expose what he called systematic deception in the art world. Lady Vivienne's fan snapped shut with audible force. The Belgian master's work that Julien was so interested in is indeed a masterpiece, madame, Poirot confirmed with a slight bow, but painted not 3 centuries ago, but 3 years ago by the man sitting before us. Monsieur Vallon, your technical skill is beyond question. Your ability to age canvas and pigments to replicate the brushwork of long-dead masters. It is truly remarkable. But Monsieur de Vere threatened to transform your greatest artistic achievement into evidence of criminal fraud. Dr. Monk leaned forward with professional interest. The chemical knowledge required for such work. Yes, I can see how someone with artistic training would have access to prussic acid. It's used in certain photographic processes for fixing silver prints. Exactly so, Doctor, Poirot agreed. But more than chemical access, this crime required the psychology of performance. Monsieur Vallon, you are an artist who understands how light and shadow can transform reality, how perception can be manipulated through careful staging. You chose this conservatory not merely for its beauty, but because you understood how its blue light would disguise the true nature of your evidence. He turned to face Vallon directly, his expression combining pity with inexorable logic. During the fish course, when Monsieur de Vere stepped away for air, you seized your opportunity. You knew from observing the service that young Ellis had confused the glasses due to the moth incident. This actually worked in your favor, as it meant you could not predict which glass the victim would ultimately receive. Therefore, the poison had to travel with him, concealed upon something he would naturally handle. During the toast, Poirot moved to the evidence table, selecting the handkerchief that Morrison had retrieved from the household linen. Your own handkerchief, monogrammed with the J of your professional identity, became the murder weapon. You applied the prussic acid to its folds, knowing that when wrapped around the glass stem, a perfectly natural gesture for a man making an important announcement, it would transfer the poison to the rim at the moment of contact. The blue light was your greatest ally and your ultimate betrayal, Poirot continued with quiet satisfaction. Under its influence, your crimson monogram appeared blue to all observers, creating the perfect misdirection. Even you believed the deception was complete, until you realized that fiber analysis would reveal the true color of the embroidery thread. Vallon finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He was going to destroy everything I had built. 15 years of work of creating beauty that brought joy to collectors around the world. He would have reduced it all to criminal scandal for his own profit. And so you appointed yourself judge and executioner, Poirot observed with gentle sadness. Yet in your desire to control every aspect of your artistic creation, you made the fatal error of returning to perfect your masterpiece. The theft of the handkerchief was unnecessary. It could never have been directly connected to you, but you could not resist the compulsion to complete your composition to ensure that every detail remained under your control. Inspector Japp stepped forward with professional efficiency. René Vallon, I arrest you for the murder of Julien de Vere. As the constables moved to escort Vallon from the conservatory, he turned to Lady Vivian with something approaching his former dignity. The works in your collection are genuinely beautiful, madame. Art should be judged on its own merits, not on the accidents of chronology. Perhaps, Lady Vivian replied with quiet sorrow, but truth has its own beauty, Monsieur Vallon, and that is something no amount of artistic skill can counterfeit. As we watched the constables lead Vallon away, the blue light seemed to lose its ethereal quality, becoming merely colored glass rather than a window into an enchanted realm. Poirot stood quietly by the fountain, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful, yet satisfied. The psychology of the artistic temperament, Hastings, he murmured as we prepared to leave, is both its greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The need to control every aspect of the performance, to perfect every detail of the illusion. This very perfectionism becomes the thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire deception. The House of Blue Glass would remember this tragedy long after the last guest had departed, yet I found myself thinking that perhaps Lady Vivian's conservatory would be more beautiful for having been the scene where truth finally triumphed over even the most skillful artistic deception. As Hercule Poirot had so often observed, there is no performance more satisfying than the moment when all masks are finally removed to reveal the face beneath, and no art more perfect than justice itself. The great glass cathedral stood silent as we took our leave, its sapphire panes catching the last light of day and transforming it into something honest and clear. The illusions had been dispelled, the truth revealed, and order restored through the methodical application of logic and psychology. Another case for the little gray cells, another victory for the inexorable pursuit of justice that defined the career of Hercule Poirot.